Welcome to the lively art of conversation. We call it Moral Side of the News, and we're glad you're with us this weekend. I'm John Blim with the WHAS Crusade for Children. With me is a distinguished panel this week: Rabbi Ben Fried, Keneseth Israel Congregation; Reverend Daniel Corrie, Shull, Burnett Avenue Baptist Church; Reverend Jason Crosby, Center College; and Father Bill Hammer, St. Margaret Mary and St. William Catholic Churches. Our first topic: it's an election year. Millions are being spent on advertising, and already both candidates for Kentucky governor are crying foul. Incumbent Andy Beshear and challenger Daniel Cameron claim ads placed by PACs or political action committees are flat out wrong. For Beshear, the topic is gender reassignment surgery for minors. For Cameron, it's been ads criticizing him for being involved with controversial pardons by former Governor Matt Bevin. Turning to our panel on Moral Side of the News, let's hear your thoughts about truth. And do ads like these persuade voters?
I do think they do. And the sad part of it is that they're able to do that. I think part of it has to do with the medium that we're using now, the information age, which has got so many incredibly wonderful benefits. But one of the benefits is being able to massively distribute misinformation as well. I'm sure everybody, when they would have gone in the past 40, 50, 100 years ago to a political rally, I'm sure that when people gave a talk, they probably didn't always accurately represent their opponent. But the only people who ever heard that was the 100, 200 people there. And now when distortions are playing, manipulating the facts, it has such a huge forum for doing that. And I do think it is actually both sides are doing it right now. So that's the sad thing is, and it does have an impact, and that's why they do it. It works. It does work, sadly.
I agree that it has an impact. Father Hammer is exactly right. But I do see some candidates who are promoting misinformation through their ads, whereas other candidates are simply exposing the political histories of their opponents, which I do think is in bounds. I'm concerned that to remove PACs from the ability to have campaign ads shuts a piece of the populace out of the process. PACs are important. Not all PACs are created equally. Not all PACs have the money that other more prominent PACs have. But I think allowing those PACs to consolidate around what they consider to be a worthy candidate and do all that they can to promote that candidate and to help that candidate win votes is an important part of the workings of democracy and our electoral process. So, but these ads, I must admit, they have been, some of them quite entertaining. Others of them have been deeply disturbing by some of the allegations that they levy against the opponent. But I think all of this is what we have now come to expect from political seasons.
Right. I mean, so I agree with my colleagues here that obviously if it didn't work, they wouldn't do it. Right. That these are people who put a lot of money. Now, we could say in the age of the internet, are TV ads the most effective way for campaigns to spend their money? But that's a campaign tactics question that I think is a bit beyond our scope. But I do think that there is. Right, like where do we draw the line between something that is misleading and something that is untrue? Where's the redress for people who have untrue things said about them? And just by virtue of running for office doesn't mean that anyone gets to say whatever they want about you and put it on air. That if there are if I wanted to slander someone here in Louisville and say they were a Wildcats fan or something like that, and they're not, then I can't just go around saying that's just that if I do that in a public way, if I do that in a way that harms them, that we do have laws in our country that protect someone from that sort of libel or slander. And I think that, right, what's tricky here is that all of these advertisements are designed in a way such as to give plausible deniability, right? That we weren't saying exactly that, or technically what we're saying is true, even if, the facts, as presented another way might not be true. And that's, the difficulty with a lot of this political information or misinformation as you look at it is there are different ways of looking at every issue. And when you present them in one way, then it's going to be different than another. So there's almost no redress to say you can't say that when if the technical facts of the matter are true, even if it gives a misleading representation of what's happening.
Yeah, Ben, that's an excellent point. That's generally where my mind was. And just to take it a step further from where you left it, for instance, the critique against Bashir that's been levied in some of the campaigns of support for gender assignment surgery. Well, let's unpack that for a moment. Medical professionals in the states say that there has not been a gender assignment surgery for a minor conducted in the state of Kentucky ever. However, their claim is that because the governor vetoed Senate Bill 150, the broad sweeping ban that addresses a number of issues related to transgender matters, their claim is that, well, Andy Bashir is therefore then in favor of gender assignment surgery, even though he's explicitly said he's not. The fact that he vetoed it opens the door for that gray area to be exploited by the opponent. And to your point, and I think it's an excellent one, the plausible deniability issue is certainly at play on both sides of the aisle. What I think these acts are really intended to do is to skirt the line as closely as possible without crossing over the whereby people engage in forms of redress that you mentioned, Ben, but ultimately to stir up vitriol, rage, and anger when it comes to hot button issues, oftentimes issues that don't affect the vast majority of Kentuckians' lives. But an issue like Senate Bill 150, gender reassignment surgery, with Cameron and the fact that he hired some individuals from the Bevin administration that were involved in the Bevin's pardons that are being scrutinized by the FBI, to my knowledge, perhaps currently. That's stirring up and trying to incite some vitriol and rage as well. What I wish is that the electorate would engage with the substance of these issues, rather than be persuaded by these emotional appeals, which are essentially what these ads are, that then move people into different camps. And in so doing, then we can't address the real issue is that Kentucky really care about because lines are so clearly and vividly drawn.
And using a little different and somewhat, I think, like religious context language, part of what you were highlighting there, Jason, is that what we in religious context would sometimes call proof texting, where you take a line, say of scripture, or a line of a religious passage, take it out of context, but use to try to prove your point. And so, yes, Governor Bashir did veto that bill. So they pull one line out of that bill and then use that as a proof against him. And that's not an uncommon practice with a lot of these type of advertising. And it's a challenge to any person of any whatever religious tradition you may be part of, to make sure you are attentive to the context in which things are spoken and said, and not pop one line out, not to see in the bigger context, which also for me raises a separate question. Has always been, it's become increasingly frustrating with the legislative process, is that more and more when you have particularly one party, and again, Republicans or Democrats, it doesn't matter, when you have one party particularly very strongly in control, a lot of times they'll put what they call like poison pills in legislation. You know, they do a quick amendment right at the very end. Because as a whole, nobody wants to vote against this overall document, but I can slip something in at the last minute and then, get something that not everybody wants to agree on. But that's another, there'd have been an up and down vote, say, on singular issue of, the gender surgery type of question, it would not have passed. But other things in that bill, would have stood alone. So that's the frustrating thing about the legislative process we're in as well, too. But I say, but even us people of religion have to be careful about proof texting.
The second topic today, we're going to transfer to Texas. Texas has spent billions to reinforce its border with Mexico. The latest move was to place floating buoy barricades on the Rio Grande River to impede crossings. The U.S. Department of Justice is suing Texas, saying the state has no authority to do this. Panel, turning to you, how far should the U.S. go to keep borders secure?
It's an interesting framing to the question. As the only one here with a Texas Longhorn book right behind me, a graduate of the University of Texas, I'll tackle this one first. I think the question is, how far do we allow individuals? How far can the federal government allow individual states to take actions on their own? And I think, this isn't just about buoys in a river. This is about, I don't know if any of you have seen the photos of children being passed through barbed wire, that this is, on our country's doorstep, there are people suffering, and that there is a governor and a state government putting policies into effect that will cause human suffering, and that will cause deep pain. And again, I understand, from an intellectual standpoint, why they're doing this, that there is a crisis or I shouldn't say crisis. There are a lot of people who want to immigrate to our country. And it is difficult to always know how to handle that as a country that needs to be able to have a border and needs to be able to, protect its citizenry. But I think really for me, the question is, how can we allow a state government to take on such cruel policies? And if the way that we can stop them from doing it is from, a statute involving naval legislation, then okay, fine. But I'm anti-kids getting caught in barbed wire. And I think that anything that we as a country can do to prevent that is probably a good thing.
We've lost our moral compass as a country. It is immigration that has made this country what it is, at least in part. My ancestors did not have the privilege of immigrating. They were forced and brought here against their wills. But so many people trace their heritages back a generation, 2 generations, 5 generations, 10 generations back to people who made a concerted effort and a conscientious decision to become citizens of this nation. And some of those individuals made that decision prompted by terrible atrocities that were happening in their native lands. And for many of the people who are coming down at the border there in Texas, they are fleeing places where incredible harm is being done to communities and to people. And as we see, they will do absolutely anything just to have a shot at living in a more safe place than the countries that they are fleeing from. And so I think it is morally abhorrent that many of our federal politicians and the politicians there in Texas are so cold-hearted that they have not developed a more comprehensive and compassionate way to deal with people who are at the border clearly needing rest and respite from what's happening in their home nations.
What comes to my mind immediately in this particular instance is a direct parallel with a biblical instance, and that is when the when the Israelites were fleeing from the Egyptians. They too had to cross a body of water, the Red Sea, and it was parted by God in order to enable those that had long lived under suffering and oppression to eventually make their way to Canaan and the Promised Land. The contrast between that act of justice and grace bestowed upon the Israelite people involving a body of water stands in marked contrast to what Governor Abbott is doing in Texas by erecting on top of the impediment that is the Rio Grande River, more impediments in the form of these makeshift barricades in the middle of that river to keep people from entering the United States. And we've known the serious consequences and harm that can be done. A second quick point I want to make, and I've noticed this creeping into the common parlance of civic discourse at the moment, and that is the quick tendency to disregard some sort of either federal or state statute as irrelevant or insignificant because people haven't heard of it. That is, in my opinion, a very slippery and dangerous slope to go down. Just because a lay person like me is not familiar with federal maritime statutes does not mean that they are not enforceable, valuable, and on the books for a reason. And so for Governor Abbott in Texas to come forth and say, well, they found some obscure federal statute to impede the state of Texas from erecting this barricade in the Rio Grande, is very dismissive of these laws that are binding for us all, and to try to downgrade and denigrate the authority of such statutes undermines the rule of law, period. That's ultimately what's happening here. As one who once upon a time went to law school, statutes trump case law. And those statutes are there for a reason. And I just think it's very dangerous for people to fall prey to this trick. And I'm not saying it's one party over and against the other. I think it can be a trick that's used by both sides of the aisle. But just to say, well, you haven't heard of this statute, and so we're going to just supersede it and run roughshod over it, is a very dangerous position from which to begin and to operate.
Yeah, I think along that line, we amongst ourselves here have highlighted actually it's a two-pronged discussion, and one that has implications significantly, not just for the care of people that we're supposed to be providing, but also for the state of law in our country and how we choose to understand and follow that. Because there has been a growing tension again between national, federal, and states' rights. That's the common, the federal government can't tell me what to do. I live in this state. So I'm free because I live in this state and I have to always follow my state laws. Well, no, we do have federal legislation for a purpose. Interstate commerce is an example of things why we have to regulate things that happen between. And so the fact that Rio Grande is a national border, not an internal state border. I mean, if we don't want Hoosiers coming into Kentucky, do we have a right to then put up barriers in the water? No, because that's water is owned by more than just us Kentuckians. You have to do it you have to discuss that. But similarly, how do we treat people who are struggling and suffering? And again, remembering the values of our nation and the values that we profess as believers as well, but particularly our founding principles and guidance, and how, again, many people had to struggle to get here, and we're the result of that. We who are here today. My family roots go back to Germany. I don't know the full story about why they came here, but I do know that. And my roots go back to Germany. And I'm grateful that I'm here. But having said that, there was a lot of risk and trial involved in trying to get to this country, I'm sure. And we need to be open to those people who most need our care and compassion. And that, to me, is one of the guiding principles of all. Even as we try to hash out, the federal, state, even sometimes in the state, even here in the city of Louisville, sometimes they're fussing about state laws imposed on us in our city, where it is that dialogue happens.
Yeah, and I think that the common thread that unites a little bit of those two prongs is the idea of out of sight, out of mind. If we can keep these people who are suffering out of sight and out of mind, then we don't have to treat them as people. Then we can just treat them as ideas or beings to be kept out. If we can keep these statutes out of sight, out of mind, because we don't like what they say, then we don't have to follow them. If we can keep our own personal stories of immigration out of sight and out of mind because they're not convenient for us right now, then we don't have to let that impact the way we think about others. And so I think that's kind of the thread that pulls those together is this this desire to put out of sight and out of mind that which either makes us uncomfortable or which makes us have difficulties or which calls us to a higher moral calling.
Very good, panel. We have a third topic on our program, Moral Side of the News, this week. We've got about 10 minutes left. The U.S. has officially re-entered UNESCO. That's the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization after the Trump administration dropped the alliance in 2017. This week's ceremony in Paris included nearly 200 member states. The Trump administration alleged anti-Israel bias within UNESCO, and now the Biden administration claims China filled a leadership gap while the U.S. was absent. Panelists, what's your reaction?
I'm glad that we made it to this topic because I think it is of greater significance than perhaps we might first think. The reality is that this entity is one that, while it lacks a great deal of legal authority over sovereign governments around the world, it is an entity that tries to ensure that there is collaboration among individuals and nation states functioning globally when it comes to educational advancement, scientific advancement, cultural preservation, as well as advancement. And for all of the struggles and critiques from various points of view that can be levied at an entity such as the United Nations, the reality is that this is yet a reminder that as we look toward the future, our world is not getting any bigger. It is only getting smaller. And entities such as this that help us strategically overcome the very barriers, national barrier that we were just talking about, to ensure that advancements are being made on various societal fronts to help us address collectively the common problems that we face. And certainly this summer, we are recording this program in the midst of the hottest day, I believe, to date this year in Louisville, Kentucky. Certainly a common obstacle that we're all going to have to confront and overcome is global warming. And it is efforts like this, it is organizations such as this that provide a framework for some of those conversations to take place that we are going to need, that we have needed, and will continue to need in the future.
Yeah, I see their efforts as, again, trying to promote intercultural, multicultural advancement, and in a sense, both preserving the past and the heritage, but also looking to the future about how we go together forward. And we need to be part of that dialogue. And again, as we talked about very early on, the very first topic, about political advertising, that there's a lot of misinformation that is put out there to try to support maybe one culture over another, and the lack that we don't need to preserve this or that. We don't want to remember this from the past, so let's do away with it. And so that's something I think we need to be part of, making sure that the truth is out there. And in preparation for this particular topic, I did a quick little study. Do you know there is a UNESCO site in Kentucky? I bet most people don't know that. Mammoth Cave is a designated UNESCO site in the state of Kentucky. There's about 30 or so in the United States, but right here in Kentucky. We've got a UNESCO site. So I'm glad we're helping us preserve Mammoth Cave.
Yeah, and I think that just in general, again, right, the going back to, what does it mean to be out of sight, out of mind? Being at the table, being in the conversations, being a part of the international community is a good thing. And UNESCO has had some, troubling resolutions. When UNESCO talks about the old city of Jerusalem, it starts its history with the advent of Islam. And for those of us, who are from other faiths, we know that a lot of things happened before that happened. And that this is not to say that everything UNESCO does is perfect, or that everything, that the way that they operate is. And the same could be said about the United Nations as an entire body. But just as I wouldn't advocate for the U.S. leaving the United Nations, so too, I think being able to collaborate and being able to work together and protect these incredibly rich cultural and heritage sites, it's important for the U.S. to be at the table. It's important for the U.S. to be taking a leadership role and to not be leaving when something happens that we don't disagree, but pushing back in other meaningful ways.
Excellent. Okay, panel, we've got about 2 minutes left. I want to hit you with this last topic. Back to school is upon us. Panel, I want to know, what was your big wish to purchase as a kid before going back to school? 2 minutes.
Picture it. 1993.
What
Nashville,
was it?
Tennessee. 1993. Nashville, Tennessee. I wanted nothing more than to have a pair of Jordan 1s. Make my grand entrance at school, and my mother would not hear of it.
Did you watch the movie that was out this summer about Jordan?
I watched it with my son. So many memories.
Corrie, I am right there with you. And interestingly, it also involves Central Tennessee. I would spend a week with my grandparents in Columbia, Tennessee, about 30 miles south of Nashville each summer. And somehow I conned and perhaps pulled some fast ones to ensure that I did get my hands on some Nike Air Jordans before I went back to school in 1993. But it took a lot of work.
Yeah, I did not get my first pair of Jordans until I bought them myself.
Bill or Ben, anything that comes to mind?
Well, I can give you a related matter to that. But in 1993, I was already a priest for 13 years. So going back to school was not an issue in 1993 for me. Not that I couldn't have still learned some things in 1993, but being a little bit older. But related to that, elementary schools that I went to were, Catholic elementary school that I went to. So we had a uniform. And so for me, the shopping going back was a new pair of school shoes, good shoes. That's not what I wanted. My wish was always for a new pair of tennis shoes. But, we could only wear those to school maybe once or twice a year on, uniform break days. So new pair of tennis shoes wasn't on my mindset to start school. So
I was just the nerdy kid. I was just the nerdy kid who was excited for school. That was me.
Yes.
All right, that's going to bring to a close our conversation on Moral Side of the News. Thanks to Ben Freed, Daniel Corrie Shull, Jason Crosby, and Bill Hammer. We'll have an all-new conversation next week. Thanks, panel.